This event features Carnegie Council President Joel Rosenthal in conversation with Linda Thomas-Greenfield, United States Ambassador to the United Nations. There is an introduction from Thomas H. Kane, Chairman of Carnegie Corporation and former Governor of New Jersey. This event took place on June 15th, 2022.
Good afternoon, or good evening, whatever it is. It's my pleasure. I'm Tom Kane. I'm Chairman of Carnegie Corporation. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the foundation. This is a wonderful kind of occasion for us. One is because, as the ambassador and I were talking, we've been involved with the United Nations almost since the beginning of the United Nations at Carnegie, and we've had a very close relationship, including having one of the Secretary Generals on our board for a while. So we've got that kind of connection. And then we've got a Carnegie family. Joel and the Council on Ethics is part of that Carnegie family. Andrew Carnegie was an amazing human being, but can you imagine, way back in the teens, he decided, in addition to institutions he was founding on foreign policy and education and the arts and all that, we needed something on ethics. I wish now more people were finding things on ethics. We probably need it now more than ever before, but Joel is head of that, of course, and to take over the program, introduce the ambassador and everything else. Joel, hand it over to you.
Governor.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Governor, thank you so much. And as you say, this is really a family event for us. So this also gives us a chance to thank you publicly for everything you've done for our council over the years and for this relationship. I also want to recognize Steve Hibbard, who's the chairman of the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, who's here with his son from California. And both Steve and Tom represent the sort of leadership of the Carnegie institutions. And under their leadership, we're really moving into the next 100 years. And when you're involved with the Carnegie institution, you think in terms of 100 years. And that speaks to the spirit of this event tonight. We wanted to reach out to some young people, in addition to our family members who are here, and give them a chance to talk to you, Ambassador, about public service, about life in the international affairs community, the work that you do at the United Nations. And perhaps just have an exchange of ideas. Governor Kane mentioned the Carnegie legacy. We were talking about this a little bit before the event, that Andrew Carnegie funded the building of the Peace Palace in The Hague. He was a true visionary. He believed in the possibilities of international cooperation. He believed it was a necessity. He believed it could happen. He believed it would happen. And all we needed to do is we needed to do two things. We needed to build the institutions, The Hague, eventually the League of Nations, the United Nations. But that wasn't enough. And one of the reasons he founded our council and some of the other Carnegie institutions was that the ideas behind those institutions mattered. And the people in those institutions mattered. They wouldn't just, the building itself wouldn't do it, and the idea itself wouldn't do it, that the people and their ideas really mattered. And that's what we're here today to talk about. So thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. I know you've had a career in public service, in the Foreign Service, more than 35 years. With many distinguished senior posts and now Ambassador to the United Nations. We're very grateful to you for sharing this hour with us this evening. And I thought I would just kick it off with a question, but I also wanted to cue the audience. This is meant to be a conversation, so I'm going to come to you soon, so prepare your questions, and we really want to have an informal conversation. Okay? But I thought I would just start out with one question, and it goes to the ethics question and the values question, and also your career in public service. And I always believe that we all bring with us to our professional lives something from our early lives. And I was wondering if you could just share with us maybe some formative experience that sort of sets you on the course to be sitting here today with us as the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations.
Wow. Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here with you today and have this conversation. And I get asked this question all the time, and I give a different answer
Good.
every single time
Good.
I get asked
Good.
the question. But I will start it with saying what I say to young people all the time, that the first chapter of your life will not define subsequent chapters of your life. And so you don't know where you're going to end up, although your first chapters may kind of give you some hint of where you might not be able to go. I was born in a small rural town in Louisiana. Actually, I was born in New Orleans, but my parents lived in a small rural town. The reason I was born in New Orleans is Louisiana was segregated at the time, and the only hospital that would see African American women was the Charity Hospital in New Orleans. So my mother went into labor, and my father had to drive the 90 miles to get her to the hospital there to give birth. And that kind of defines where I came from, because I grew up in the segregated town. My father was uneducated, in fact, illiterate, and my mother was undereducated. She was a cook. And most people who know me really well know that I cook really well. It's the only thing I'm not humble about. Even today, someone challenged me to a gumbo cook-off, and I said, bring it on. But I grew up in a large family. I was the oldest of 8. My mother took in everyone, and our family gathered around meals. And we still do that to this day. But the one thing that she taught me that I bring with me every single day in my job is kindness. Be kind. Just be nice, be compassionate, be decent to people, even if they're not decent to you. Because I saw many times when people were not decent to my mother, and she still was always decent. And it stuck with all 8 of her kids. We're all like this. And so that has really, it's defined how I approach foreign policy, how I engage with my colleagues at the UN, friends and foe. I always approach them with kindness. I will add that when I was in 8th grade, Peace Corps came to my community. There was a small Baptist college that had closed down. And in the 1960s, Peace Corps brought Peace Corps volunteers there to train, and they were getting ready to go to Africa, and they invited some of the young kids in the community to learn the languages with them. So they were going to Somalia and to Swaziland. So I got to take Siswati as a language when I was in 8th grade. I don't speak a word of it now, but it did influence me. It introduced me to a world that was really far outside of the community that I was in. So I would eventually end up going to graduate school, and here I am.
That's great. That's a great question. I can't resist a follow-up, though, because you talk about kindness, but I would imagine in your job you must confront unkindness, if not cruelty. And how do you process that as being a representative of the United States and in a world in which we're living through some almost unimaginable cruelties?
The best weapon that we can have as a diplomat is kindness. And so even when you are dealing with your foes and you're giving them the riot act, a smile goes a long way in getting the message across and getting understanding. I'll share very briefly one story from my life. I was in Rwanda during the genocide. I was in a situation, it's a much longer story, with a young man with a gun at my head. And I just kind of smiled at him and said, "My name is Linda." And I wanted him to know, I thought, if he's going to kill me, at least he needs to know the name of the person he killed, and I got his name. So, And then suddenly the gun was down and we were having a conversation. And I thought, was that what saved my life? I don't know if that's what saved my life, but I've decided it did. And it was, again, attacking an attacker with a smile.
Right.
And so I was at the school, I was telling you, Governor, the University Heights High School in the Bronx last week, and their motto is "Be kind." And the kids all had shirts on that said "Be kind." So they gave me one, and I was in California last week, and I wore it when I went for a walk, and everybody stopped to smile at me. And I'm thinking, I can't even go to California and people don't know who I am. I realized they didn't know who I was. They liked the shirt. So be kind.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think history shows that the problems start when people are dehumanized in some way, and to the extent that you can humanize. The process of diplomacy, policy making is so important. I have one more question, then I'm going to open it up. So I see some new leaders over there. Just that's your cue. But one more question. We have a podcast series at Carnegie Council, and it's called The Doorstep. And the idea of the doorstep is, this is sort of inspired, I suppose, by political leaders or community leaders that need to go out and make the case at the doorstep of a citizen. And this is related to global affairs, and we sort of call that the doorstep test. How do you make the case for the importance of an organization like the United Nations and for the work that you kind of do? So. Do you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you, I'm sure you've thought about this going back to, let's say, your hometown or whatever, and talking to people who this may not be their profession or even their interest, but why what you're doing is important?
It's actually one of my highest priorities in this job. It's not war and peace. It's going to the doorsteps of Americans and letting them know why the UN is important to them, why the work I do should matter to them. Why should they care about what is happening in Ukraine? And the reason we care is because of our values. And that's why this is important to Americans. We care about humanitarian. Americans open their doors to Ukrainians. They open their doors to Afghans. And the UN provides that platform for us to bring these kinds of crises and issues to the doorsteps of Americans so that they can show the core value that we have, and that is that we care. But we're also fighting for democracy. When Ukrainians are standing boldly fighting against Russia, they're not just fighting democracy for their own country. They're fighting for our democracy as well. They're fighting so that we don't have to fight, so our soldiers are not on the ground. And that matters to Americans. And when we go into the stores and see what we're paying for everyday goods and see what we're paying for gasoline, war somewhere else in the world will impact our everyday lives. So it is important that we use the one platform that we have to deal with war and peace, and that's the United Nations. Not a perfect organization. I always acknowledge to people it's not perfect, it's what we have. And we have been able to achieve some positive things, even as it relates to Ukraine.
Great, thank you. Okay, the floor is open. I know that there are microphones that are going to come around. Yuris, I know you have a question because you submitted one.
I know, so when
this has been planted, so.
Oh, okay, I was about to say, when no one raises their hand, I just kind of look at the face that is like, don't call on me.
You're a good teacher.
Thank you, Joel. It is a planted question in a way because I did submit it ahead of time, so Joel has an idea what I'm going to ask. But I have, a softball question for you to start out. So what are currently key United States foreign policy priorities as it comes to United Nations? And has there been a change from the Trump to Biden administration, really? Like, fundamentally, has there really been a change?
You know, the president laid out our key priorities on day one. He laid it out during the campaign, that we were going to reassert our leadership in multilateral forums. So we immediately rejoined WHO. We immediately rejoin the Paris climate. Exactly, just had a brain freeze. We have restarted the discussions with the Iranians on the JCPOA. We re-engaged because we weren't engaging during those 4 years. We also know that when we're not exerting our leadership, others will. And what we saw happen during those 4 years is as our leadership space was ceded, the Chinese moved in. And they are in a much more powerful position at the United Nations today than they were 5 years ago. And I have received, the US government has received a warm welcome back to the UN. In fact, almost an embrace the day we came back in, with people saying, we missed you and we need you. We need your presence because we can't fight this alone. We need you sitting in the Human Rights Council, another one that we rejoined on day one. We need you sitting at the table, and sometimes we're sitting at the table with people we don't want to be sitting at the table with, but because we're sitting there, we can push back on their efforts to undermine human rights and undermine the rules-based system that we are all part of.
Over here. Sorry, Felicia, to make you go all the way. I don't know if you can see.
Yes.
Good evening. Good evening. I know many of my colleagues and classmates know for a fact that the UN is a hardworking organization, but many Americans feel like it's ineffective and the US should pull out of it. What would you say to the young Americans that are feeling cynical about the UN work and the work that you do?
I'll give you a cynical answer. Don't imagine a world without the United Nations, because the United Nations is the one place where 190 countries and organizations, and I don't know the exact number, but somewhere around that number, can come together and deal with issues that impact our lives every day. It's not just war and peace. It's about developing the rules that will govern how we use the digital world and how we use technology. It's about looking at rules about how we deal with space. And maybe people don't realize how important those things are, but the day it's gone, they will know immediately that the UN is missing. We had some extraordinary successes in the UN that most people don't know. So they see the Security Council and they think the Security Council is not working because the Russians can veto. They vetoed a resolution condemning them. Of course, if we had a resolution condemning us, we'd probably veto it as well. But we took them to the General Assembly, and we got 141 countries to vote to condemn them. We were praying we would get 120, which is what we got on Crimea in 2014. We got 141, and then we took another resolution to the General Assembly supporting Ukraine's need for humanitarian assistance, and we got 140 countries to support us. So the Russians have tried to shut us down. They've tried to veto our voices. They've not succeeded in doing that, and I think the United Nations system is stronger because of that, because we've been able to use the system in a way that let the Russian government know that it is unacceptable what we see them doing. The United Nations doesn't have an army. They're not going to go in, and of course we'd never get every country to agree that the United Nations can go in and end the war in Ukraine. That would be impossible. But what we can do is influence the situation. We can provide humanitarian assistance to the millions of Ukrainians who have been forced from their homes. We can provide assistance for their resettlement in other places so that their kids can go to school. So there are so many things that we do that will make a difference in the lives of people. and it wouldn't be done without the United Nations.
Shreya, if you could wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Hi. So there are two parts to my question. One was I was reading some of your comments in the discussion hosted by the Atlantic Council on climate change displacement. So I'll read you my question, but then I also have a friend who works for a non-for-profit that helps refugees because of climate change. And she got very excited. I had a chance to ask you a question, so I'll also read you her comments.
So you're taking questions from other people too.
Sorry. My question was around just, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you propose in terms of like partnership between the public and private sector to help climate change refugees. And my friend's exclamation was, there's so much work that needs to be done in building up the narrative that people are being displaced by the climate crisis. There's a wave, parentheses, spearheaded by the US, end of parentheses, of countries militarizing their borders and heightening their security because of climate-related destruction. Humanity needs to engage in this huge narrative shift of how we respond to the crisis in a way that's humane and trauma-informed. So that's what she had to say.
My answer to that is I agree. On the private sector, there's so many things that are happening and so many reasons people move related to climate change. It may be because of drought. It could be because of pest. It could be flooding. And this is where there are companies that work on those issues. So people don't leave their homes because they want to leave their homes. So if we can help them find solutions that will address the problems that they're facing, I think more people would remain in their homes. So working with the private sector to see where the private sector may be able to move into areas where flooding is happening and figuring out how we do irrigation systems that will allow people to remain in their homes. Or in areas where there's drought, what can be done to address drought so that people can remain in their homes. And it took a while for the international community to accept that there was something called climate refugees. Climate refugees were treated like economic migrants. They're leaving because they're looking for a better life, not leaving because they have to leave. And I think we've all come to understand that because of climate, people are forced to leave, and that climate change has an impact on security. And so people leave their homes because it's also insecure as a consequence of climate change. Look at Nigeria, where you have herders encroaching on farmland, and people are being killed and leaving their homes because of that. Or you have situations like in the Sahel where people are being attacked by terrorists and they have no other choice but to leave because they can't take care of themselves in the desert. So again, I think this is something we're all beginning to work to understand and to address. But I think we all agree that we can work with the private sector to find solutions, and that we absolutely have to do something to support those communities that are being forced from their homes due to the climate.
Oh, we have to go here. I'm going to go to Nadav, and then we'll go behind.
Thank you for coming, first of all. My question is regarding Iran. You mentioned the negotiations. So what do you think should be done in order to prevent Iran from getting nuclear capabilities and weapons?
I mean, President Biden has been clear that we will not accept an Iran that has nuclear power. And that's one of the reasons we want to get back into the climate, into the agreement with Iran. We think we provided, we've given them what we basically, our approach was compliance for compliance. We're willing to comply, go back into compliance if the Iranians go back into compliance. We've basically gone back into compliance, and now the ball is in the Iranian court to do that. They have put additional conditions on coming back into compliance, and that has delayed us moving forward with a deal. But we've not given up on the deal with them. And we think if we can get that deal, it will slow their efforts to develop a nuclear weapon, although we've seen that they have made a lot of progress in the years that they've been out of the agreement.
Mohan?
Thank you to Carnegie for this opportunity, and Ambassador, it's a pleasure to interact with you. Quick question, you mentioned that China is playing a more dominant role in global governance, including in the UN, be it with funding, be it with the positions they hold in different organizations. But I'd be curious, where are the areas of cooperation that you can see engaging with your Chinese counterparts? And maybe also behind the scenes to hear a bit more about the relationship you have with the PR here, the Chinese ambassador here in New York.
Well, first, we've been able to work with them on issues related to climate change. And Secretary Kerry has been very proactive in talking with them and getting their agreement on some of the major climate commitments that we've wanted from them. We passed over the course of the month of May, when I was president of Security Council, 3 Security Council resolutions that the Chinese supported and agreed on, and they were actually voted on unanimously. We're now working with the Chinese and the Russians on the Syria renewal, which has to be renewed by July 10th, or the one last border crossing from Turkey into Syria, providing humanitarian assistance to over 1 million people, will close. Last year, we were able to get that resolution extended. I am meeting with both my China and Russia colleagues to talk about how we can move this agenda forward. So we do have areas of cooperation. We're very cordial. We're very professional with each other. It's not a warm and fuzzy relationship, but it's a very professional and respectful relationship. We know each other's red lines, and when I cross their red lines, they will tell me I've crossed their red lines, and when they cross ours, I tell them they've crossed our red lines. So we're able to have these frank conversations, and generally we know where each other will be, how we will respond. So we put forward a resolution on DPRK a few weeks ago, and we were initially hopeful that the Chinese would abstain. They eventually ended up vetoing, along with the Russians. But one interesting change that has happened in the UN system over the past few months is a Liechtenstein resolution that we co-sponsored that requires that every member of the Security Council, every permanent member of the Security Council who uses their veto will be called before the General Assembly to explain why they use their veto, and they were called before. And it was not a comfortable situation for them. And I can tell you they were annoyed because they didn't want to be put in a situation of having to veto. Yet we felt that the DPRK had been so aggressive. They tested, 22 times since January, and the council had sat silent. And so my view was even a veto will let them know that the council has spoken. So 13 members of the council supported it and only 2 vetoed. And for me, that said to the DPRK, you do not have the support of 13 members of the council. But, you know, we kind of knew in the end where the Chinese were coming from. We have a P5 coordination group. The Chinese are the current sponsors of the coordination group. So we meet as a P5 on a regular basis. The full council also, we do a social event once a month because whoever is president of the council will do a lunch or dinner with the Secretary General. And we all participate in those events. And again, when the cameras are not in front of us, we're cordial to each other. But if I got a camera in front of me, I'm not going to be seen putting my arms around my Russian colleague or my Chinese colleague or even smiling. And someone I learned, the Russian said something in the council a couple months ago, and I gave him the side eye. Well, I had never even heard of a side eye. And the cameras caught it. And then it was all over Twitter that I gave this side eye, and I was saying to myself, what's a side eye? And they're like, I'm like, he sits on my right-hand side. He gets a side eye all the time. It's all part of the dynamics of the council, but we all know we have to work with each other.
Eddie.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your service and for being an extraordinary role model and inspiration to so many who could now consider and envision a career in the Foreign Service. A recent CFR report noted that the senior ranks of the Foreign Service are almost 90% white and 69% male. My question is around representation and how important is it for the United States Foreign Service to reflect the diversity of the U.S. population, and are there things that you think can work in trying to make it more diverse?
Thank you so much for asking me that question. That, too, is one of my highest priorities as a career Foreign Service officer, to ensure that our Foreign Service is diverse. Our Foreign Service needs to look, the face of the Foreign Service needs to look like the face of America. And it says everything about our values, and it says everything about how inclusive we are. I always share this example. I was in Ethiopia some years ago at an AU meeting, and I had a regular meeting with my Chinese counterpart. And one of my colleagues was a Chinese American. And the Chinese walked into the room, and they didn't know who this guy was. It was like, why is he here? Is he one of ours? And I could see their faces. And when he sat at the table beside me, I was just so proud. I think it just made the statement to have him sitting there at the table with me. And people need to understand that we have to reflect our values. We have to reflect our diversity in all of its forms. It's a strength that we have that no other country has. So I do a lot of recruiting. The reason I was at University Heights High School was not about just speaking to the kids. The reason I'm here is because you have young people in the audience, not you old folks like me. But we take old folks in the Foreign Service as well. Look at me. But again, to encourage young people to really get out and say to young people, you can be like me. My family gave me a T-shirt when I was appointed UN ambassador, and it has my picture on it, and my nieces and nephews wore it to school and said, my UN ambassador looks like me. And my family didn't know how meaningful that was to me, because it said to every little black girl, you can be a UN ambassador. I didn't think I could be a UN ambassador. I'd never heard of a UN ambassador when I was in high school. It never was on my radar that there was someone in this position. So again, I think our diversity is important, and we have to proactively recruit. And it's not just recruiting for diversity, it's including and sustaining for diversity, because what has happened in the State Department is we lost a lot of people. They just decided to leave because we recruited them, but we didn't embrace them. And they didn't feel a part of the service. And the new generation of young people don't take the crap that my generation took. So I took the crap. I took the slights and just kind of brushed them aside. And my view has always been, you're slighting me is your problem, not mine. So I never took people's racism as my problem. The younger generation is, you guys are different, and you're not going to take this license. It's like, I don't have to deal with this. I can go and work at Google. So Google and Facebook, they've been recruiting, taking our people like nobody's business. Is there anyone from Google or Facebook here? We train our people well, and we're just losing people. We're sieving people of color because they are also trying to make their workforce more diverse. And they don't even have to train because they get from us people who speak the languages, who have diverse experiences overseas, and they can just walk in the door and start to work. So we do have to do a better job of retaining our people and including them, not just recruiting them. General Austin said something like, and I loved it when he was asked about this. He says, "It's one thing to be invited to the dance. The other thing is to be invited to dance at the dance. So if you're sitting on the wall and you're a wallflower, then you're not included."
Thank you for that. Leslie.
Thank you, Ambassador, and also thank you to Joel and to Carnegie Corporation. It's an honor to be here. I'm from Chatham House, and I have a question for you. I guess it's a two-part question. And it's one that you will be very familiar with. Around the world, despite the 141 countries that voted alongside the US to condemn Russia's aggression, there are some really important countries that continue to call out Western hypocrisy. They point to 2003, they point to Libya, they point to any number of things, and whether we agree or don't agree, the importance of having a consistent and clear responses, I'm sure you would know more than anybody, very important. So I'm firstly curious what your response is when you hear that critique.
I hear it every day.
The second part of my question goes to the country that I live in. And I guess it's very easy, perhaps, to know where you stand with one's adversaries, whether it's China or Russia or Iran. But sometimes America's closest friends do things that seem morally questionable. And as you know, the UK government is currently trying to push a policy that entails sending asylum seekers on planes to Rwanda. That was prevented yesterday. There's now a conversation about potentially pulling out of the European Court of Human Rights. So what do you do when America's closest friends do things that perhaps America doesn't support?
So to your first question, I heard it every day. And what I say is, what did you do in 2003? And what did you do in 2013 with Libya? You know, how did you respond? You thought it was wrong. What was your response? And if you thought that was wrong, does that make what is happening today right? Because what we're looking at today is an attack on all of our values. It's an attack on democracy. It's an attack on the UN Charter. And so because you think we were wrong 10 years ago, you're going to do something wrong today. So I'm not going to own what happened years ago. What I am owning today is that there's no neutrality, there's no abstentions when it comes to what we see Russia doing in Ukraine. And if I'm sitting in my apartment and I'm overlooking Long Island and I'm looking at the high-rise buildings, imagine those buildings are Ukraine. Right now, every single building would be destroyed. You cannot tell me you think that is right. And you're going to punish Ukraine because you think we were hypocrites 10 years ago. So leave us out of the equation. Support Ukraine. So that's what I say to them. And your other question is it's also an easy one. It's with your friends that you can be honest. You can say to your friends, this is really not the right thing to do, and you need to rethink that. But of course, we also make mistakes. You know, I was so horrified when I saw Haitians on the border and some guy on a horse with a whip whipping a Haitian migrant. And what I think is our strength is I can be horrified in public about what my country does. I can comment in public about what our country does. I can acknowledge our mistakes and push for us to do the right things. And what I say to China is own up to what is happening to the Uyghurs in China. They won't own up to it. They won't acknowledge what is happening. Our strength is that we do self-assess, and we're constantly self-correcting. We're not perfect, but we at least attempt to self-correct, and other countries, many other countries don't.
Ronnie.
Oops.
Oop.
Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. I'm one of those people who works for Facebook and is also
You're stealing our people.
in foreign affairs. Anyway, I did have a question for you. One of my mentors early in my career was Mortar Bromowitz, who I'm sure you know, former career ambassador, foreign service officer like you. And I was at his home during the last administration, and he had mentioned that one thing people don't appreciate about what was happening at the State Department was these relationships he had built in his career for 34 years with other foreign service officers, and they rose through the ranks, and he would call them, and he would get things done. When he was ambassador to Turkey or to Thailand, he could call on people he'd met when he was 20 and get foreign policy done. And his big concern was the decimation of the State Department, which means that there's whole generations of people who can't get things done because they didn't build these relationships growing up through the ranks. So I wanted to ask you, have you called on favors for people you met earlier in your career, throughout your career, even today? Mm-hmm. And what do you think we can do to build the State Department back up so we build that, have that next generation diplomats?
Good. His wife was my mentor.
She was a great friend of mine. She wore the best hats in Washington.
She wore the best hats, and she brought me into refugee work, and I spent most of my career doing
We worked at IRT together.
Oh, okay, so you know her. I have called those relationships. I spent 35 years in the Foreign Service, and my biggest problem is that African leaders got my personal phone number. I can't, my personal phone has become my work phone because no matter how I try, even President Biden called me once on my personal phone. I'm like, but I do call on those relationships all the time. People are shocked. I had left government and I was here in New York during High Level Week, and I was standing in a hotel, and all these African heads of state were going by, and they were all like, hey, Linda. And I heard someone say, who is that woman? And they're like, we don't know, because I'd been out of government, and they're like, we don't know. So this guy comes over to me and he's like, who are you? And I said, I'm Linda. But I made sure that I spent 35 years on the continent, on and off. I met President Sirleaf in 1978. So I knew her before she became president. I met the president of Namibia before he became president. So I knew many of them before they even became presidents. And, you develop relationships. It's not always friendships, it's relationships. So I know when I make a call, they're going to take a call from me. But they also know when they call me, I'm going to take the call, including, 3 o'clock in the morning when President Museveni called me because he was angry. And my phone rang at 3 in the morning. I answered it and it said, this is Yoweri. And I'm like, who? Yoweri? And I'm like, who is that? He said, President Museveni. And I'm like, oh, okay. And then my husband is like, who's calling you at 3 o'clock in the morning? And I said, it's the president of Uganda. So yes, I know what Mart was talking about, that, over the course of 30 years, you start to know people personally. You see them, and you can be honest with them. I can have an honest conversation and say, it's time to go. They don't listen all the time, but they may vote with us. So I may not be able to influence what they're doing now in their countries, but I can say, look, we need your vote.
Oh, here, yes, we'll go 1, 2, okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Felicia, sorry, miscommunication. There we go.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hi.
It's nice to see you. I met you in person. So
Where?
Right now.
I thought you meant before.
No. So you touched on something that is really dear to me by African president, and I wanted to ask a question before, like if you have any relationship with those presidents, and if you, of course, are seeing what is happening in Africa with those presidents that don't want to leave, and make for the population to have like a really hard time in their own countries. So what is the UN really doing in regard to that? Because there is a lot happening in there right now, and the population itself can't do anything without the UN. And then also the ambassador. So what are you doing, like in really helping the population to be able to live in peace without being killed by its own army? It's really frustrating to see that.
Thank you for asking that question. And as you know, there are UN peacekeepers all over the continent of Africa. And Africa has the largest number of peacekeepers. The UN can't kick out a leader. We can only try to influence those leaders to make the right decisions for their people. I will share with you a conversation I've had with African PRs here in New York who have complained bitterly that the world has rallied to support Ukraine. You guys don't rally to support Africa. And so that's been their narrative. And basically what I've said is, even the Russians didn't block us from having a meeting on Ukraine in the Security Council. Africans, with the Russians and the Chinese, block us from having meetings. I couldn't have a meeting on Ethiopia and what is happening in Ethiopia. Unless we can work around them, we can't do it. Africans don't condemn each other. So yes, the Europeans circled the wagon around Ukraine because it's in their neighborhood, and they open their doors to Ukrainians because it's in their neighborhood. Africans have to open the door for other Africans in their neighborhood, and they have to criticize each other and circle the wagon around people who are being brutalized by their countries. They don't criticize leaders. It's a boys' club. And so they don't criticize each other because they know they can be on the other side of the criticism as well. The AU won't take initiatives, in my view, in a significant way when it relates to Africa. And the AU is sitting in Ethiopia, and we're seeing atrocities being committed in Ethiopia. And the AU would not say anything. So I have not allowed, I've not accepted criticism that we have ignored Africa because we're all focused on Ukraine. Because Africans, in my view, on occasions have ignored each other and not taken, and I'm probably the only non-African PR who can get away with telling them that. I don't think anybody else can get away with telling them the emperor has no clothes other than me. And so I do use that constantly to remind Africa that Africa has to take ownership of the issues in Africa and lead on those issues. And I've tried to be a follower on issues in the Security Council as it relates to Africa, but occasionally I have to lead, and I don't shy away from it.
If I can have a follow-up, you said taking initiative, right? Africa has to. So when you saying taking initiative, are you talking about like the population itself, or the president, or our young person, and then how are we going to go about it?
Yeah.
Because if, as you mentioned, it's really hard for you to be involved, and that the president themselves in there are not making the way for us to do that. So how can we do that?
Your regional organizations, I will say that ECOWAS, for example, has been very strong. They were strong in condemning the coups in Mali and holding the Mali government accountable. So many of the regional organizations have the ability to do that. It's going to have to be the presidents, although I think young people in Africa are going to really rule the world one day. There's extraordinary resilience in the community, extraordinary creativity. So young people have to be prepared to take over and to take leadership. It's not going into the streets and being shot at, which will occasionally happen. But we've also seen what happened in Sudan when young people, women, went into the streets and they were able to get rid of Bashir. It's still a work in progress, but they made a difference.
Maybe you could pass the microphone here to you, Ray.
As somebody who has extensive career experience in diplomacy towards Africa, how have you seen U.S. foreign policy towards Africa evolve? And do you believe these efforts through foreign policy are strong enough to counter the Chinese and Russian influence in Africa? And my second part to that question would be, well, from my perception, a lot of the narrative in media can be particularly xenophobic, leaning towards xenophobia. So how can we engage in criticism towards Chinese influence in Africa without leaning into these certain rhetorics?
I've seen our policy on the continent of Africa go through waves, where we're very proactive and engaged, and other times we're less engaged, and then it goes up again. So it has not been consistent over many years, but what has been consistent is our relationships with the continent of Africa. And what I have always reminded my Chinese colleagues that we have, one of our strengths on the African continent, is we have an African diaspora. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure if I went around this room among the people of African descent, at least half of you are from somewhere in Africa, and you're hyphenated Americans. And that's a strength that we have that the Chinese will never, ever be able to compare with. And you can advocate for your countries and your policies in the United States in ways that no one can do, and it's a strength that we need to spend more time building up and pushing for that kind of advocacy around the continent. In terms of the xenophobia, we've seen it happen all over the world, not just in Africa. You know, in South Africa against Nigerians, and then the Nigerians counterattacked South African businesses in Nigeria, and it's something we need to fight anywhere in the world, not just on the African continent. I think from the vantage point of the United States, we do need to focus more attention on Africa. I think we have a good story to tell. If you look at the kinds of programs we have, Young African Leaders Initiative, I mean, we've probably had more than 100,000 young leaders across the continent connect through this network of young African leaders. African leaders who have lived and studied in the United States. I could probably point to at least a dozen people who are current presidents who studied in the United States at some point or another. So we do have those relationships that I think we have to nurture and nourish.
So I have, is there one? Oh, go ahead, thank you. This is going to be the last question.
Yeah.
And I'm a Carnegie new leader working for the UNDP Crisis Bureau. And speaking of UN peacekeeping, last year, on the 9th of September, the Security Council anonymously adopted its first resolution on UN transitions, urging all UN peacekeeping missions, special political missions, to start planning for withdrawal at the earliest possible stage. Also in line with the UN Secretary General's Transition Planning Directive. My question to Your Excellency would be, how high is UN transitions of UN peacekeeping on your agenda? And how can we ensure better host government ownership of these transition processes, also involving more local actors? Thank you.
Yeah, the answer to that question is really easy. We're the largest contributor to peacekeeping operations. Our assessed contribution is 27%. We never go up to 27. We had some legislation that put us at 25, and so each year we have to get special dispensations to pay the 27%. So we watch and engage and monitor peacekeeping missions very, very closely. And we do want to see them transition, and they can. I was part of the transition of the peacekeeping mission in Liberia, one of the largest per capita peacekeeping missions on the continent of Africa. We had 17,000 UN troops in a country with just 4 million people. And we engaged with the government, with the president, with the UN, and worked to start the process of turning over functions to the government and eventually transitioning the UNMIL forces out of Liberia. And I think it's a real success story.
Well, that's great. Maybe we can end with a success story. That's great. The hour is up, so I have to conclude the formal session, but thanks to our family, we have a family reception here, so there will be some time for some informal conversation once we adjourn. Thank you all for coming, and let's have a drink.
Thank you.